Hello friends, and welcome to the Lost Ghastly Journal. In the shadowed heart of the Appalachian Mountains, between the years of 1847 and 1874, a chilling series of disappearances plagued the isolated community of Havenwood. A total of 97 individuals vanished, not in a chaotic panic, but with a horrifying clockwork precision. Every 3 months, on the night of the new moon, a person would disappear, leaving behind a single left-foot leather shoe. This shoe was always filled with a mixture of mountain soil and pine needles, and it was invariably found placed with ritualistic care in the center of the missing person's bed. The clay within the shoe was still warm to the touch, as if recently unearthed from deep beneath the earth. When federal investigators finally reached the secluded settlement in the bitter cold of 1874, they were met with a baffling scene. 312 residents living in what seemed like unimaginable wealth for such a remote location. Their financial records displayed an impossible level of prosperity. Their children were dressed in clothing from big cities, and their tables were filled with exotic foods. Yet not a single person would explain the whereabouts of the vanished. In their official reports, the investigators noted that every resident they questioned responded with the exact same unnerving phrase, delivered in an identical, flat tone: "The mountain keeps its own accounts." What those investigators eventually uncovered in the depths of the abandoned copper mine beneath the village was so profound and disturbing that the full report would be sealed in government archives for over a century, requiring special authorization to access. Even today, the full document remains partially censored. The truth about Havenwood begins not with the disappearances themselves, but with the desperate founding of a community willing to do anything, absolutely anything, to survive the harsh, isolated life of the mountains in the years before the Civil War. Havenwood was nestled deep within a valley so profound that sunlight only graced it for a mere 4 hours a day, even in the height of summer. The surrounding peaks stood like colossal stone sentinels, their slopes so sheer that clouds would snag upon them, spilling into the valley like thick cream poured into a bowl, leaving the settlement shrouded in a persistent cold mist for days at a time. The community was founded in 1845 by 43 families fleeing the economic ruin that had decimated the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania. They sought a new beginning, a place where sheer will and honest toil could still bring prosperity. These were not outlaws or vagrants. They were skilled miners, craftsmen, and engineers whose lives had been built on diligent labor, only to watch it all collapse when the mines shut down and the banks failed. The journey was led by a former mine foreman named Elias Thorne, a man who had spent 2 decades underground and claimed he could sense the presence of copper in the rock from a mile away. At 53 years old, Thorne led the families with the restless energy of a man half his age. Those who had known him from the old Pennsylvania mines spoke of his unsettling ability to find treasure where others saw only lifeless stone, and how he would press his ear to a rock face, insisting he could hear the metal singing to him from within. His wife had passed away in an illness outbreak in 1832, leaving him with 3 sons who had all followed him into the mines. It was for them, and for the grandchildren now beginning to arrive, that he sought this new opportunity. The families who followed Thorne into those mountains carried surnames that would later be scrubbed from all official records, as if they had never existed. The Blackwood family from Philadelphia brought their expertise with explosives, their patriarch having helped blast the first railroad tunnels through the Alleghenies. The Schmidt family, recent German immigrants, understood the complex chemistry of ore processing, their knowledge coming from studies at the University of Heidelberg before political unrest forced their immigration. The MacGregor clan from Scotland, whose patriarch had designed ventilation systems for the deepest mines in Europe, brought innovations that could be the difference between life and death underground. The Shepherd family included Reverend Jacob Shepherd, a minister who saw in this treacherous journey a chance to forge a truly devout community, one sealed off from the sin and depravity of the cities. Each family brought a specific, coveted skill, handpicked by Thorne during months of clandestine meetings in Pittsburgh taverns and church basements. He had approached them one by one, speaking in hushed tones of his secret surveys and tested samples, of a discovery that could make them all wealthy beyond their wildest imaginations. More than mere wealth, he promised them independence, a chance to build a society accountable to no one but themselves, free from the greedy coal corporations and banks that had destroyed their previous lives. The location Thorne chose was far from accidental. He had first learned of the valley from an old local guide he'd met in a tavern in 1844. The guide, speaking a mixture of his native tongue and broken English, had told him of a valley his people avoided, a place where the water ran crimson after a storm and where the very earth seemed to breathe. Local legends, recorded by missionaries decades earlier, spoke of the valley as a sick place, where wild animals refused to den, and where strange lights were sometimes seen moving beneath the ground on nights when there was no moon. The guide's people called it the place where the earth bleeds, and their oral histories indicated that even the ancient peoples who had come before them had marked it as a forbidden place. But Thorne saw opportunity where others saw only a warning. His own initial surveys, conducted with equipment he had borrowed from his former employers, revealed enormous copper deposits of unprecedented purity. The geological formations suggested veins that went deeper than any mine in North America, copper that had formed under conditions that shouldn't exist in the Appalachian Range. He kept his findings a closely guarded secret, sharing them only with his most trusted associates, knowing that if word leaked, larger interests would sweep in and claim everything. The journey to the valley took 3 weeks, traversing terrain so brutal that 2 wagons were lost to deep ravines, and one family turned back after their youngest child was nearly swept away in a swollen creek. Those who persevered found themselves in a valley that seemed to exist in its own separate world, cut off from the rest of America by walls of stone and forests so dense that noon felt like twilight beneath the canopy. By the autumn of 1846, Havenwood had swelled to nearly 200 souls. The speed of their construction was astonishing. In less than 18 months, they had built a sawmill powered by a stream that ran red with mineral deposits every spring, staining the mill wheel a permanent rusty color that resembled dried blood in the dim light. They established a general store run by a former merchant from Philadelphia who kept meticulous records in ledgers that would later provide investigators with their most damning evidence. They built a one-room schoolhouse where a kind woman taught 32 children using books donated by a mysterious benefactor who insisted on remaining anonymous. The community's church, completed in the winter of 1846, stood at the very center of the settlement, its spire the only structure tall enough to catch the morning light before it reached the valley floor. Reverend Shepherd preached every Sunday about divine providence and perseverance, about how their God had led them to this promised land, just as he had led the Israelites. His sermons became increasingly focused on sacrifice and covenant as the months passed, though few noticed the gradual shift in his theology at the time. Havenwood even had its own postal route, though the carrier, a local mixed heritage man, only made the treacherous journey once a month. The carrier would later testify that he always felt watched in Havenwood, that the residents would gather in hushed groups and stare when he arrived, and that no one ever sent personal letters, only business correspondence related to their copper trade. But the prosperity in Havenwood came with unsettling peculiarities that visiting traders noticed immediately. The settlement produced refined copper ingots of remarkable purity, 99.9% pure, according to assayers. Yet no one ever saw the smelting operation. Work shifts began at midnight and ended before dawn, with miners entering and leaving through a concealed entrance that visitors were politely but firmly prevented from approaching. The miners themselves never spoke of their work, changing the subject if questioned, and their families seemed to have been instructed to maintain the same unnatural silence. The copper they produced had unusual properties that made it highly sought after. Telegraph companies paid a premium for Havenwood copper wire, claiming it conducted electricity with less resistance than any other source. Jewelers in distant cities reported that items made from the copper never tarnished, maintaining a strange, peculiar warmth to the touch that customers found appealing. One academic from a prestigious university traveled to Havenwood in 1847 to study the copper. But his notes from the visit were later found to be missing crucial pages, and he refused to discuss his findings, retiring from academia shortly after his return. The first disappearance occurred on March 15, 1847, exactly 18 months after the settlement's founding. The date would later prove profoundly significant. It was not only the night of a new moon, but also the spring equinox, when day and night stood in perfect balance. Margaret Schmidt, age 19, vanished from her family's cabin sometime between sunset and sunrise. She was engaged to be married, and the wedding had been planned for May. Her parents woke to find her bed empty, though the sheets remained perfectly arranged, as if she had never slept in them. The window stood open despite the freezing temperatures, with a film of ice formed on the inside of the glass. And centered precisely on her pillow was a single leather shoe, her left one, placed with deliberate care and filled with damp soil and pine needles that smelled of deep earth and something else, something metallic and organic that no one could quite identify. The shoe itself was disturbing in its condition. While it was certainly Margaret's, it showed signs of wear that didn't match its age. The sole was worn through in places, as if she had walked for hundreds of miles, yet she had owned the shoes for only 2 months. The leather was stained with mineral deposits that had crystallized in strange patterns resembling veins or root systems. When her mother tried to empty the clay from the shoe, she found it had hardened into a perfect mold of her daughter's foot, accurate down to the smallest detail. The community searched for 3 days with a thoroughness that reflected both their desperation and their growing terror. They divided the forest into a grid, with each family responsible for a section. They combed every inch within 5 miles, checked every mine shaft and cave, and dragged the creek from its source to where it joined the larger river. Thorne himself led search parties up treacherous mountain paths where snow still lay 3 feet deep, places where a single misstep meant certain death. They brought dogs from a neighboring settlement, but the animals refused to track, whining and cowering when presented with Margaret's scent. What they found disturbed them more than her absence. Near an old marker stone, a granite boulder covered in symbols that predated even the local inhabitants, they discovered 17 dead ravens arranged in a perfect circle. Their bodies were still warm, despite the freezing temperature, and each bird had died at exactly the same moment, their necks twisted at identical angles, their wings spread in identical positions. At the center of the circle, pressed into the frozen earth, was a handprint that matched Margaret's exactly, though it was pressed deeper into the ground than any human hand should have been able to achieve. Fresh axe marks on trees formed a path leading directly to the sealed entrance of what locals called the Old Working, a mine shaft that predated even the local legends. The axe marks themselves were peculiar, cut at angles that hurt to look at directly, forming patterns that seemed meaningful but remained just beyond comprehension. The second disappearance came exactly 3 months later, on June 15th, the summer solstice. This time it was William McGregor, a man strong enough to carry 200 pounds of ore on his back for miles without rest. He vanished from the mine's entrance station, where he'd been keeping watch, a duty that rotated among the men of the settlement. His replacement found the guard post empty at midnight, a single shoe placed on the stool where William should have been sitting, filled with the same warm mixture of clay and pine needles. William's rifle remained propped against the wall unfired, and his pipe sat on the small table, still smoking, as if he had just set it down moments before. The locked door to the mine entrance stood open, though the key remained in William's shoe along with the clay. Inside the entrance tunnel, investigators found prints in the dust, but they started 30 feet inside the tunnel, as if William had materialized there rather than walking in.
The prince proceeded deeper into the mine for about 100 feet before stopping abruptly at a solid wall of rock, as if he had walked directly into the stone. By September, when 8-year-old Timothy Blackwood became the third to vanish, panic gripped Havenwood. The boy disappeared from a group of children playing in the afternoon sun. The other children reported that he had been there one moment and gone the next, like a candle being snuffed out. They found his shoe in the exact center of the church, though the building had been locked and Reverend Shepherd held the only key. The clay in this shoe contained something new, tiny fragments of what appeared to be crystallized blood, though no one could explain how blood could crystallize in such a manner. Families barricaded doors with wedges and bars, and few dared to venture outside at night.
Lumber torn from the mill. Men patrolled with rifles loaded with bullets they'd blessed in the church. Women clutched their children close, tying them to their wrists with rope when they had to leave the house. Some families attempted to leave, but found a reason to stay. A sick child, a broken wagon wheel, a sudden storm that made travel impossible. It was as if the valley itself conspired to keep them there. It was then that Thorne called a town meeting that would change everything. The entire population gathered in the church on a night when the fog was so thick that people could barely see 3 feet ahead. They came in groups, holding hands to avoid getting lost, their lanterns creating ghostly halos in the mist. Standing before every remaining soul in Havenwood, Thorne spoke words that multiple witnesses would later recount with chilling consistency, each remembering not just what he said, but the exact cadence of his voice, as if the words had been burned into their memories. "We came here seeking fortune, and fortune demands sacrifice," he said. "The mountain gives us copper, copper gives us wealth, and wealth demands payment. We all understood this when we signed the compact. We all agreed to the terms. The lottery is fair, the selection is random, and the obligation is absolute. We are not the first to make this bargain, and we will not be the last. The mountain has been feeding for longer than human memory, and it will continue to feed long after we are gone. But for now, for our time, we are its servants, and it is our provider." That's when Martha Shepherd, the Reverend's wife, stood and asked the question that would haunt survivor testimony for decades. "What did you find in the old working, Elias? What did you wake up?" Thorne's response was to produce a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, written in a language that predated any known indigenous script. But somehow, impossibly, everyone in the church could read it, the meaning flowing directly into their minds without translation. The journal told of a previous mining operation, centuries old, maybe millennia, that had discovered the same copper deposits and made the same bargain. It contained detailed instructions for the ritual of selection, the schedule of sacrifice, and, most disturbingly, a ledger showing that exactly 2,347 people had fed the mountain before this previous civilization had disappeared, leaving only the sealed mine and the warning stones the local people had wisely chosen to respect. The history of the old working stretched further back than any written record, into the realm of geological time where human history became indistinguishable from myth. The local oral tradition, meticulously documented by an ethnographer in 1891, spoke of a hole in the earth that existed before memory, before the migration of peoples, perhaps before humanity itself crawled out of its caves. The locals never mined there, never hunted within 5 miles of it, and their medicine men performed annual ceremonies to keep it sealed, ceremonies that required the sacrifice of precious trade goods and sometimes took weeks to complete. They called it the breathing place, where the earth exhaled its poisons and inhaled its sustenance. Their stories told of a time before time, when beings that were not quite human and not quite spirit had delved deep into the earth, seeking something that was never meant to be found. These beings had built structures underground that defied understanding. Chambers where up became down, tunnels that folded back on themselves yet still led somewhere new. and spaces that were larger inside than the mountain that contained them could possibly accommodate. According to the local stories, these ancient miners had eventually disappeared, but not through death or departure. They had become part of what they mined, their flesh transforming into metal, their bones into ore, their blood into the red water that seeped from the mountain every spring. The locals believed that on certain nights, you could still hear them working in the depths, the ring of their picks against stone carrying up through miles of rock, though the sound came from directions that didn't exist in the normal world.
Spanish explorers in 1561, according to fragmentary records discovered in an archive, reported finding evidence of extensive pre-Columbian mining operations in the central Appalachians. One of the lieutenants wrote in his journal of discovering perfectly round vertical shafts descending beyond the reach of their longest ropes, with walls so smooth they seemed melted rather than carved. The shafts were precisely 3 feet in diameter, too narrow for a man to work comfortably, yet they showed clear evidence of excavation. The lieutenant's most disturbing discovery was a chamber accessed through one of these shafts, where he found what he described as statues of such lifelike quality that he initially took them for corpses. These figures were made entirely of copper, but with a level of detail that exceeded any known metallurgical technique of the period. They depicted humans in positions of agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which, their faces turned skyward, their hands raised as if in supplication or surrender. When one of the men struck one of these figures with a hammer, attempting to break off a piece as evidence, the entire statue crumbled to dust, and the man fell ill immediately, dying within hours while sweating a fluid that smelled of copper. The indigenous guides refused to approach closer than 100 yards to these sites, claiming the holes belonged to the Star Walkers, beings who came before and would come after, who had descended from the sky to harvest the blood of the earth. They said these beings had not died, but had chosen to merge with what they sought, becoming eternal guardians of treasures that should never see daylight. One guide told the lieutenant that his grandfather's grandfather had seen lights moving underground near these shafts, lights that moved in patterns that suggested intelligence but followed no human logic. When Thorne's expedition first arrived in 1845, they found these ancient workings partially collapsed, but still accessible. The main shaft descended 400 feet through solid rock before opening into a natural cavern system of staggering complexity. The initial descent was treacherous. The original ladder system had long since rotted away, leaving only the iron brackets embedded in the stone, many of which had been transformed into copper through some unknown process. Thorne and his men had to install new ropes and wooden platforms, working by lamplight in a shaft so perfectly vertical that dropped tools would fall for nearly 30 seconds before the sound of impact echoed back up. But it was what they found in the deepest accessible chamber that changed everything. The walls were covered in a crystalline copper formation unlike anything in geological textbooks. Copper so pure it could be peeled off in sheets like paper. The metal grew in patterns that resembled organic structures, branching like blood vessels, spreading like neural networks, forming nodules that pulsed with a light that wasn't quite phosphorescence and wasn't quite reflection. When Thorne first placed his hand on one of these formations, he reported feeling a shock that wasn't electrical, but something else, something that traveled not through his nerves, but through his bones, carrying with it images of places that couldn't exist and times that hadn't happened yet.
A chemist who had studied at a university before immigrating conducted secret tests on the copper in a makeshift laboratory he built in his cabin cellar. His notes, discovered hidden in his cabin wall decades later, described properties that defied known science. The metal maintained a constant temperature of exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of ambient conditions. Even when placed in ice or held over a flame, it remained at human body temperature. When melted and recast, it produced ingots of impossible density. A cubic inch weighed 3 times what it should have according to copper's known properties. And strangest of all, when placed in water, the copper caused the liquid to move in patterns that resembled breathing or circulation. The water would pulse rhythmically 20 times per minute, creating tiny whirlpools that spun in alternating directions. If multiple pieces of the copper were placed in the same container, they would synchronize their effects, the water moving in complex patterns that suggested communication between the metal fragments. The chemist wrote that watching these patterns for too long induced severe headaches and nightmares of being underground, unable to breathe yet unable to die. The settlement's prosperity was undeniable and immediate. By 1850, Havenwood was producing more refined copper than any 3 mines in the territory combined. The families lived in houses that would have been considered mansions in major cities. Their children wore clothes from afar, ate exotic fruits in winter, and studied from books imported from London and Paris. The settlement had luxuries that major cities lacked, such as running water in every home, heated by copper pipes that maintained their mysterious warmth, and gas lamps that burned with a peculiar blue-green flame that never seemed to consume its fuel. Yet no outsider ever saw a single miner emerge from the earth covered in the dust and grime of honest labor. The men who worked the night shift appeared at dawn clean and dry, their clothes unmarked by the usual stains of underground work. When questioned, they would simply say the mine was well ventilated or remarkably clean, but their eyes would drift away, focusing on something in the distance that only they could see. A federal surveyor arrived in Havenwood in September 1851, tasked with mapping mineral claims for the newly formed state. His official report described a thriving community with inexplicable characteristics that defied conventional understanding of mining settlements. But his private journal, discovered in his granddaughter's attic in 1923, told a story that transformed the government's understanding of what had transpired in Havenwood. The surveyor wrote of being housed with a family where he noticed that meals were set for family members who never appeared. Each evening, the matriarch would lay out 7 place settings, though only 4 family members ever sat at the table. When he asked about the empty chairs, she would simply say, "They're working below," her voice carrying a strange resonance as if she were reciting a memorized phrase. The empty plates would be cleared at the end of each meal, and the surveyor noticed they showed signs of use, despite no one having touched them. On his 3rd night in Havenwood, unable to sleep due to a persistent humming that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, he followed a group of men who left the settlement at midnight. He tracked them through the forest, noting that they walked in perfect formation despite the absolute darkness, with no lanterns or torches, moving through the trees as if following a path visible only to them. They led him to a clearing where the entrance to the old working lay concealed beneath a wooden structure disguised as an equipment shed. He watched 30 men descend into the earth in complete silence, their movements synchronized like dancers following unheard music. Each man carried nothing but a small leather pouch hung around his neck, and as they descended, the surveyor heard them humming. Not with their voices, but somehow with their entire bodies, a vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He tried to count them as they entered, but the number kept changing in his mind, sometimes 30, sometimes 300, sometimes 3. He waited until dawn, hidden in the underbrush, fighting off waves of nausea and vertigo that grew stronger the longer he remained near the mine entrance. Only 28 men emerged as the first light touched the mountains. They walked out in the same synchronized fashion, but now their pouches bulged with weight, and their skin had taken on a subtle sheen as if they had been coated in the finest copper dust. The 2 missing men were never mentioned, never mourned, never even acknowledged as having existed. When he carefully asked Thorne about the mine's operation the next day, the foreman's response chilled him to his core.
Thorne smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "The mine takes its share, Mr. Vance. 2 from 30 is a reasonable tax. Your government takes far more and gives far less in return. Would you like to see our operation? We could use a man of your qualifications." The surveyor left Havenwood that afternoon, claiming urgent business elsewhere. His official report stated only that the settlement's mineral claims appeared legitimate, and that the copper production was substantial and of high quality. But in his journal, he wrote, "There is something unnatural in that place, something that wears the face of prosperity but stinks of decay. The copper they produce is real enough, I've tested it myself, but the cost of its extraction is measured in more than dollars. I fear that what they have awakened in those depths will not be satisfied with the sacrifice of a few. It will grow hungry, it will demand more, and God help us all when it can no longer be fed." The disappearances continued with a mechanical precision that suggested not randomness, but careful planning. Every 3 months on the new moon, someone vanished, always at night, always leaving behind that single shoe filled with clay and pine needles. The clay was always warm and always contained new elements, fragments of minerals unknown to science, crystallized organic matter that resembled neither plant nor animal tissue, and sometimes tiny spheres of metal that moved on their own when observed, rolling always toward the mine. The victims varied, young and old, male and female, newcomer and founding family member. But investigation of settlement records revealed a horrible truth that the federal investigators would later try to rationalize as coincidence. The disappearances followed a pattern. They were selecting exactly one person from each family in rotation, maintaining a grotesque fairness that ensured every household shared the burden equally. No family lost 2 members until every family had lost 1. The selection seemed random within each family, but the broader pattern was undeniable. One of the men who had lost his son in the second disappearance began keeping detailed records in a journal he hid in a hollow tree a mile from the settlement. His writing, cramped and increasingly frantic as the years passed, documented not just the vanishings, but the wealth that followed each one. Within days of a disappearance, the mine's copper output would surge by exactly 33%. New veins would be discovered in previously barren rock, and the quality of the ore would improve dramatically, requiring less processing to achieve that impossible purity. He also documented changes in the settlement. The people were transforming, slowly but inexorably.
Unmistakably, their skin developed a subtle copper tint that was most visible in sunlight. Their eyes began to reflect light in the dark like a cat's, but with a greenish hue. Children born in Havenwood after 1850 never cried, not as infants, not when injured, never. They would simply stare with those reflective eyes, waiting patiently for their needs to be met. By 1858, his journal entries had become increasingly disturbed. He wrote of dreams shared by the entire settlement, dreams of moving through stone as if it were water, of breathing metal instead of air, of a vast intelligence that existed in the spaces between atoms, in the crystalline structure of the copper itself. He wrote of waking to find his wife standing at the window speaking in a language that hurt to hear, conversing with something in the mine that answered in harmonic vibrations that made the whole house resonate. By 1865, with the Civil War ending and federal authority reasserting itself across the reconstructing nation, Havenwood could no longer remain isolated. A railroad company planned a spur line through the valley to facilitate copper transport. Government agents inventoried resources for the reconstruction effort, and an investigative journalist arrived, drawn by rumors of a settlement where people vanished like smoke, but copper flowed like water, where children were born without crying, and where the night shift miners worked in perfect darkness yet never had accidents. The journalist spent 3 months in Havenwood, posing as a traveling merchant interested in establishing regular trade. What he discovered exceeded his darkest suspicions and would eventually lead to his commitment to an asylum, where he would spend his final years drawing obsessive diagrams of impossible underground geometries. The settlement operated on 2 distinct levels. The surface life of a prosperous mining town, complete with socials, church services, and schoolhouse recitations, and a hidden structure of ritual and sacrifice that had evolved into something resembling a religion, though it worshipped no god that any sane person would recognize. The transformation had been gradual, so slow that the residents themselves seemed unaware of how far they had drifted from normal human behavior and belief. The journalist attended what residents called gratitude gatherings, held in the church on the night before each new moon. The ceremonies began as seemingly normal prayer meetings, with the reverend reading from the Bible and leading hymns. But as midnight approached, the service would shift, the language would change, starting with familiar Latin phrases but evolving into something older, words that predated any known human tongue. The congregation would respond in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to achieve, creating sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the ground beneath their feet, from the very air they breathed. The Reverend, once a conventional minister who had preached about salvation and grace, now spoke of the covenant of the depths, the blessed transaction, and the willing gift. He had modified the Bible on his pulpit, inserting new pages that appeared to be made of beaten copper, so thin you could almost see through it, covered in text that shifted and changed depending on the angle of viewing. He preached that God had many faces, many names, and that the one they served in Havenwood was older than the Christian God, older than any god worshipped by man, as old as the metal in the earth itself. The congregation had developed its own catechism, which the journalist transcribed phonetically, as the words themselves seemed to resist being written in English letters. "What do we owe?" they would chant. "Everything we are and will be. To whom do we owe it? To that which dwells in the deepness. How do we pay? With willing flesh and grateful souls. When will the debt be paid? When the last star burns cold and the earth gives up its final secret." On the night of December 15th, 1865, the journalist witnessed a selection ceremony that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every resident gathered in the church, including infants carried by their mothers and elderly citizens who had to be helped to walk. The fog that night was so thick it seemed solid, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. The church was lit by candles made from a substance that wasn't quite wax. They burned with that blue-green flame that characterized all fire in Havenwood, and they gave off a smell that the journalist described as copper and corruption, metal and meat. A copper vessel was produced, ancient beyond description, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to move and writhe when observed peripherally. The vessel was passed hand to hand through the congregation. Each person dropped in a small personal item, a button, a coin, a thimble, a child's tooth, a lock of hair. The objects made no sound as they fell into the vessel, as if dropping into a space much larger than the container itself. Then Thorne, now 60 years old but seemingly untouched by age, his hair still black, his hands still steady, his eyes burning with that green reflection, reached into the vessel. His arm went in up to the shoulder, though the vessel itself was no more than a foot deep. He searched for what felt like hours, though the clock showed only minutes passing. Finally, he withdrew a single object, a brass button from the coat of a recent widower who'd arrived only 6 months earlier, fleeing debts and sorrow. The widower stood without protest, though tears ran down his cheeks. His neighbors embraced him, weeping and whispering things in his ears that the journalist couldn't hear, but that made the man nod and smile through his tears. His children, twin boys of 14, were taken to stay with a family who promised to raise them as their own. There was a ritual to it all.
movements and words that had been refined through repetition, 27 years of practice making the horrible efficient. That night, the widower walked alone to the old working. The journalist followed at a distance, watching the man move through the fog with the certainty of someone who could see his path clearly. At the mine entrance, the widower removed his clothes, folding them neatly and placing them on a bench that had been built for this purpose. He put on a robe made of a material that looked like cloth but moved like liquid, clinging to his skin in ways that defied physics. Then he descended into the shaft. The journalist waited until dawn, hidden in the same spot where the surveyor had watched 14 years earlier. But the widower never emerged. As the sun rose, the journalist crept to the mine entrance and found the widower's left shoe placed precisely on the bench where his clothes had been. The clothes themselves were gone. The shoe was filled with the familiar clay and pine needles, but also with something else. A photograph of the widower's late wife, though it had been transformed, the paper now made of thin, beaten copper. Her image was still visible but changed, her eyes now seeming to follow the viewer with an awareness that no photograph should possess. But the journalist discovered something else that night, something that would make his exposé impossible to publish without being dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Hidden in the records of the settlement's founding, in a strongbox buried beneath the church cornerstone, he found the original compact, the agreement signed by every founding family. The document was written on what appeared to be human skin, though it had been treated with copper salts that
Had turned it green and given it a metallic sheen. It wasn't just a mining charter or land claim. It was a contract written in English, but referencing concepts and entities that belonged to no earthly jurisdiction. The compact spoke of those who dwell beneath, of the hunger of the deep, and of the price of extraction. It laid out the terms in horrifying clarity. In exchange for unlimited wealth from the earth, the community would provide willing vessels on a schedule determined by lunar cycles. The selection would be random but fair. The chosen would go willingly, or the entire community would suffer consequences described only as the rising and the consumption. The contract was signed not just with names, but with blood. Each signature was brown with age, but still seemed wet to the touch, still smelled of iron and copper. Most disturbing of all was an addendum added in Thorne's hand and dated 1847. Having discovered the true nature of the bargain and finding no escape from its terms, we hereby accept our role as shepherds of the feeding. We understand that our prosperity is built on consumption, that our wealth flows from sacrifice, and that our children and our children's children shall inherit both the blessing and the curse. We pray that God, if He still watches this forsaken place, will forgive us for what we have become and what we must continue to be. The journalist also found records of attempts to break the compact. In 1853, a family had tried to flee in the night. They were found the next morning in their wagon at the settlement's edge, their bodies transformed into copper statues, perfect in every detail down to the expressions of terror on their faces. The statues were melted down and the copper distributed among the remaining families, who wore jewelry made from it as a reminder of the price of betrayal. In 1859, a group of younger residents attempted to seal the mine with explosives. The detonation had no effect on the entrance, but the conspirators aged 50 years in a single night. Their hair turned white, their skin wrinkled, their bones brittle. They lived only a few more days, spending them warning others that the mine was not just a hole in the ground, but a mouth, and that it had teeth that extended throughout the entire valley. Everything changed on the night of March 15, 1874, exactly 27 years after the first disappearance. The number 27 held significance that the journalist had discovered in his research. It was 3 times 3 times 3, a number that appeared repeatedly in the pre-Columbian symbols found in the mine, a number that the local people considered cursed, a number that represented completion in the arcane mathematics that governed the compact.
The settlement had known this night was coming, had been preparing for it with increasing anxiety as the date approached. The selection ceremony chose Mary Thorne, Elias's own granddaughter, a girl of 16 who was engaged to marry a young man who had been born in Havenwood and had never known life outside the valley. Mary was beloved in the community. She taught the youngest children their letters, helped care for the elderly, and had a voice that could make even the strange hymns they now sang sound beautiful. For the first time in 27 years, someone refused to go. Mary barricaded herself in her family's home, using furniture to block the doors and windows. She had prepared for this possibility, having suspected she might be chosen. The pattern had become predictable to those who paid attention, and her family's turn had come around again. She had written letters hidden throughout the house, explaining her refusal. In them she wrote, "I have seen what happens to those who go below. They do not die. Death would be merciful. They become part of something that should not exist. Their consciousness is trapped in metal, their souls dissolved in copper, aware for eternity of what they have become. I will not go. Let the compact be broken. Let us face whatever consequences come. Better to die as humans than live as whatever we are becoming." The entire settlement gathered outside the Thorne house. They pleaded with her for hours, their voices growing increasingly desperate. As midnight approached, parents held their children up to the windows, begging her to think of them. The elderly reminded her of all the prosperity the compact had brought, the lives it had enabled, the community it had built. Her own grandfather, Elias, knelt in the mud that had formed from a sudden, unseasonal rain, pressing his hands against the door and speaking to her in that old language that predated words. As the new moon rose, invisible in the dark sky, the earth began to respond to the broken contract. The ground beneath Havenwood started to vibrate, not like an earthquake, but like breathing, like a gigantic chest expanding and contracting. The rhythm matched no human heartbeat. It was too slow, too deep, each breath taking minutes to complete. With each exhalation, a warm wind rose from cracks that appeared in the earth, carrying with it the smell of copper and something organic, something alive, but in no way that biology could explain. The water in the creek reversed its flow, running uphill toward the old working, and as it flowed backward, it turned red. Not the rusty red of mineral deposits, but the bright crimson of fresh blood. Fish in the creek were swimming backward too, moving against their own will, their eyes reflecting that green light that had infected everything in Havenwood. Birds fell from the sky, not dead, but transformed. Their feathers turned to copper wire so fine it looked like hair, their bodies still moving, still trying to fly with wings that could no longer generate lift. And from the mine shaft came a sound that survivors would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. Not quite screaming, not quite singing, but something that contained elements of both. It was the sound of the 93 people who had been taken over the years, their voices somehow still present, still conscious, calling out from wherever they were, whatever they had become. Some witnesses claimed they could identify individual voices, a girl singing a lullaby, a man calling for his father, a little boy reciting his arithmetic tables in an endless loop. Thorne made a desperate decision. He understood perhaps better than anyone what lay beneath Havenwood, what they had awakened and fed for 27 years. He knew that if the compact was broken, if the feeding stopped, what dwelt below would rise to take what it was owed. And it would not stop with Havenwood. The hunger that had been contained, directed, controlled for nearly 3 decades would spread. The copper veins that ran beneath the mountains connected to deposits throughout the continent, perhaps throughout the world. If the thing below was released from its bargain, its hunger would follow those veins like an infection through a bloodstream. Accompanied by the 3 other founding members still alive, an old chemist who was still strong from years of handling copper that had changed his very bones, a man who had documented everything and understood the patterns better than anyone, and Reverend Shepherd, who had transformed their faith to accommodate their damnation, Thorn descended into the old working one final time. They carried with them items that had been prepared for this possibility. Ropes made from human hair collected from 27 years of haircuts, carefully braided and treated with copper salts. Lanterns that burned that blue-green flame, but could somehow illuminate spaces that normal light couldn't. And most importantly, the original copper vessel that had been used for every selection, now filled with the personal effects of all 93 who had disappeared, items that had been carefully preserved for reasons that were about to become clear. What happened in the depths that night was witnessed only by the journalist, who had hidden himself in the mine's upper galleries days before, surviving on rainwater and biscuits, determined to see the truth of Havenwood, no matter the cost to his sanity. His account, written in a shaking hand on pages torn from his notebook, some of them stained with what appeared to be copper-tinted tears, described scenes that challenged the boundaries of the possible, while remaining entirely within the realm of the physical. The four old men descended past the copper formations that everyone knew about, past the worked galleries where miners extracted their wealth, into chambers that had never been mapped because their geometry changed depending on who observed them and when. They descended for what felt like hours, but what the journalist's pocket watch insisted was only minutes. Time itself became unreliable in the deep places of the earth. They reached a chamber that the journalist struggled to describe, not because it was indescribable, but because describing it accurately would require admitting that everything humans understood about space and dimension was incomplete. The chamber was simultaneously vast and intimate, its walls miles away, yet close enough to touch. It was lit by the phosphorescent minerals that had been mentioned in old reports, but the light they gave off didn't behave like light should. It cast shadows that fell upward. It illuminated things that weren't there while leaving visible objects in darkness. And there, in the center of this impossible space, they found the source of Havenwood's prosperity and curse. It wasn't a monster or a demon, but something worse. The evidence of a previous human civilization that had discovered the copper deposits centuries or millennia before. The walls were covered with the mummified remains of hundreds of bodies, perfectly preserved by the unique mineral composition of the cave. They were arranged in precise patterns, each one positioned at the terminus of a copper vein, their bodies penetrated by metal that had grown through them like roots through soil. But they weren't dead, not in any conventional sense. The copper's unique properties, its constant human body temperature, its breathing patterns in water, all made horrible sense. The metal was somehow sustaining them in a state between life and death, using their biological processes to catalyze its own growth. They were conscious, aware, trapped in bodies that had become geological features, their nervous systems transformed into copper wire that transmitted not electrical signals, but something else, something that predated human understanding of consciousness. The 93 people who had disappeared from Havenwood were here too, integrated into the system, their bodies in various stages of transformation. Margaret Schmidt was recognizable, though copper had replaced her hair and grown through her skin in patterns that resembled the grain in wood. Her eyes were still aware, still capable of focusing on the men who had entered the chamber. When Thorn approached her, she moved. Not much, just a slight turn of her head, but enough to show that she recognized him, remembered him, perhaps even forgave him. And at the center of it all was something that had no name, because it predated naming. It wasn't an entity, but a process, a function of the universe that humans had never been meant to discover. The copper wasn't just a metal, it was a medium, a substance that could preserve and transmit consciousness across geologic time. The civilization that had first discovered this had tried to achieve immortality through it, had fed themselves to it willingly, believing they were transcending death. Instead, they had discovered something worse than death,
eternal awareness without agency, consciousness without control, existence without end. Federal investigators arrived 3 days later, summoned by telegraph messages that spoke of earthquakes and disasters, though no seismic activity had been recorded by any instruments outside the valley. They found Havenwood in a state of chaos that defied their attempts at rational explanation. The mine had collapsed, but not in any way that geology could explain. The rock had flowed like water and then hardened in patterns that looked organic, like the mountain itself had squeezed the tunnel shut the way a throat swallows. The old working was sealed beneath thousands of tons of stone that had materialized from nowhere, rock that didn't match any geological survey of the area. Elias Thorne and his 3 companions were missing, presumed dead in the collapse, though their bodies were never found. Mary Thorne was alive, but changed. Her hair had turned white overnight. Her eyes had lost their green reflection and turned gray as mountain stone, and she spoke only in whispers that hurt to hear. She would tell the investigators nothing useful, responding to all questions with the same phrase. They chose to hold the door closed. Pray it stays that way. Most disturbing of all were the 93 members of the settlement who were found wandering the forest in various states of confusion and madness. They had no explanation for how they came to be there. The last thing each remembered was going to sleep in their homes in places scattered across the country, some of them years or decades ago. They were people who had been reported missing from towns throughout the Appalachians, people who had vanished without a trace or explanation, people whose families had given them up for dead. Medical examination revealed they all showed signs of prolonged exposure to extreme mineral concentrations. Their hair had turned white, their skin bore strange scarring patterns that resembled copper veins running beneath the surface. And they spoke in whispers of dreams about being buried alive while somehow remaining conscious, aware of every grain of soil, every drop of water that passed through the earth around them. Several had to be restrained when they tried to return to the collapsed mine, insisting they had left something important below, though none could say what. The government's official report, classified until 1974, concluded that Havenwood had been the site of illegal mining operations using dangerous practices that led to widespread metal poisoning, causing hallucinations and mental instability among the population. The settlement was evacuated, the land condemned, and the entire valley declared off-limits to development under the pretense of geological instability. The report made no mention of the 93 people who had apparently returned from the dead, officially listing them as displaced persons who had been found during the evacuation. But the journalist's hidden journal, discovered in the wall of his asylum cell after his death, told a different story. Before his final descent into madness, he wrote how the 4 old men had made a final bargain in the depths. They had offered themselves as permanent guardians, their bodies to be integrated into the system, not as fuel, but as regulators. Their conscious will focused on a single purpose, to keep what dwelt below from rising, to maintain the seal between the deep places and the surface world. The collapse, the journalist claimed, wasn't an accident or a natural consequence of the broken compact. It was Thorne using the last of the mining explosives, charges that had been placed throughout the mine over the years for this exact purpose, to seal the old working forever. But it wasn't just rock that came down. The journalist probably didn't realize it, but the charge detonated all the internal processes that had been going on in Havenwood. The copper that had formed in all these years outside the mine was set off by the explosion. It set this endless chain of events in motion that basically sealed Havenwood completely off. Completely sealed off from what dwelt below, the old civilization. Not all of the information would go on, but some of it would go on.
A physical seal. The 4 men had positioned themselves at key points in the underground chamber, allowing the copper to grow through them while they still lived, while their wills were still their own. They had become living locks, their consciousness the only thing keeping the door closed. The 93 survivors were relocated across the country by the federal government, their families scattered to prevent them from gathering again. Most died within 5 years, their bodies unable to adapt to life away from the mineral-saturated environment of Havenwood. But before they died, many reported the same recurring dream. They were standing in a vast underground chamber, watching 4 old men slowly turning to copper. Their faces frozen in expressions of eternal determination, their bodies spreading like roots through the rock, holding closed a door that must never be opened. Mary Thorne, whose refusal had broken the compact and precipitated the final crisis, disappeared from federal custody during the relocation. She was never found, though reports from the 1880s describe a woman matching her description living among a local tribe, teaching their children about the dangers of disturbing the deep places of the earth and the importance of keeping certain doors forever sealed. She was said to carry with her a copper vessel, ancient and covered in symbols that hurt to look at, which she claimed contained the last testament of those who had learned too late that some knowledge comes with a price that can never be fully paid. The land where Havenwood once stood is now part of a federal wilderness area, closed to all public access under severe penalty. The official reason is geological instability and contamination from historical mining operations. Satellite images show that nothing grows in a perfect circle with a 5-mile radius around the former settlement. The earth there is neither dead nor alive, but something in between, waiting. Water samples from the area still show impossible copper concentrations, copper that maintains that constant temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, copper that causes water to move in breathing patterns. Every 3 months, on the night of the new moon, seismic equipment stationed around the perimeter registers rhythmic vibrations from deep underground, vibrations that match the pattern of human breathing, though much slower, as if what breathes below has learned patience in its imprisonment. The vibrations are strongest on March 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and December 15th, the dates when the sacrifices were made, as if something below still expects to be fed on schedule. In the decades that followed the sealing of Havenwood, there were several attempts to investigate the site, all ending in failure or tragedy. A team of geologists arrived in 1889. They managed to bore 30 feet into the collapsed mine entrance before their drill bit struck something that shouldn't have existed, a vein of copper that was liquid at room temperature and flowed upward against gravity. When they withdrew the drill, the substance that came with it defied classification. It appeared to be copper mixed with organic material, as if metal and flesh had somehow fused at a molecular level. The team sealed their borehole with molten lead, a material mentioned in Thorne's notes as being antithetical to the copper's growth, and left within hours. Their official report stated only that the site was geologically unstable and unsuitable for further investigation. Local hunters in the 1880s and 1890s reported finding leather shoes in the forests surrounding the forbidden zone. Always the left one, always filled with clay and pine needles that remained warm to the touch regardless of the weather. By the turn of the century, exactly 97 such shoes had been documented, one for every person who vanished during Havenwood's 27 years of operation. The shoes were always discovered on the nights of the new moon, placed with deliberate care on tree stumps or rocks, containing not just clay, but sometimes other items, a photograph, a button, a child's tooth, objects that had belonged to the disappeared, yet somehow remained untouched by time. The few guards assigned to patrol the perimeter in those early years had their own superstitions. They claimed that on certain nights, always the new moon, always at the quarterly dates when the sacrifices had occurred, they could hear something calling from underground. Not voices exactly, but vibrations that formed words in their minds, 97 distinct tones speaking as one, promising wealth beyond imagination to anyone brave enough to unseal the mine. Tools left near the border would be found the next morning, moved closer to the center as if drawn by a magnetic attraction.
Compasses became useless within a mile of the site, their needles spinning wildly before pointing not north but straight down into the earth. Perhaps most significant was a letter discovered in the private papers of a former president after his death, dated 1874. The situation in West Virginia has been contained, but at terrible cost. We must ensure that no one ever attempts to reopen that mine. The four who sacrificed themselves to seal it understood what I cannot put in official records, that some hungers, once awakened, can never be fully satisfied, only temporarily contained. Their vigil must not be disturbed. Zoti. The letter was accompanied by a map showing copper deposits throughout North America, with Havenwood at the center of a vast network of veins that stretched from Alaska to Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Certain locations on the map were marked with red X's and dates. Other sites where similar discoveries might have been made and quickly sealed, where other communities might have made other bargains, where other doors might be waiting for someone foolish enough to open them. In the final entry of the journalist's journal, dated just days before his death, he wrote with surprising clarity, "I've seen the truth of Havenwood, and it has broken something fundamental in my understanding of the world. We tell ourselves that the earth is rock and soil, dead material from which we extract dead wealth. But the earth is alive in ways we cannot comprehend, and in some places it is hungry. The 97 souls who fed that hunger are neither dead nor alive, but something between, something that should not be. And the four who chose to become eternal guardians, to transform themselves into living seals, they are the only thing standing between that hunger and the world above. God help us if their vigil ever fails." Mary Thorne was never officially found after her disappearance from federal custody, but stories persisted of a woman matching her description, traveling through Appalachian communities, warning them about the dangers of deep mining, teaching them to recognize the signs of copper that grew too pure, that maintained impossible warmth, that caused water to breathe. She was said to carry with her an ancient copper vessel, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to move when observed directly, which she claimed contained the last testament of those who had learned too late that some bargains could never be broken, only transferred to the next generation of the desperate and ambitious. The final official document regarding Havenwood was filed in 1891 by the newly formed U.S. Geological Survey. It designated the entire valley as
permanent exclusion zone with access forbidden under federal law. The report noted that the area exhibited anomalous geological properties inconsistent with regional norms and recommended that no future mining or development be permitted within a 10-mile radius. The specifics of these anomalies were sealed, requiring congressional approval to access, approval that has never been granted. Local folklore in the surrounding counties speaks of Havenwood as a cursed place, though the stories have been deliberately confused and contradicted over the years, perhaps to prevent anyone from understanding the full truth. Some say it was a plague that killed the settlement. Others claim it was a mine collapse. Still others whisper about deals made with things that live in the deep places of the earth. All agree on one thing. The mountain remembers what happened there, and it waits with infinite patience for someone to forget why the seals were put in place. The copper mining industry in the region continued to grow through the end of the 19th century, but certain unwritten rules emerged among the mining companies. Never dig below a certain depth. Never pursue veins that maintain human body temperature. Never work mines where the water flows uphill or where copper grows back after being harvested. These rules were never officially acknowledged, but were passed down from foreman to foreman, from company to company, a secret knowledge that some things were more valuable left in the ground. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that the government truly sealed away all evidence of what happened at Havenwood? Or could there be more sites like this hidden in America's forgotten corners?
places where desperate people made impossible bargains for prosperity. Leave your comment below and tell us your theory about what really happened to those 97 souls. Are they truly gone, or are they still down there, conscious in their copper prisons, waiting for someone to break the seal that Elias Thorne and his companions died to maintain? If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. And remember, some doors are sealed for a reason. Some hungers should never be fed. And some bargains, once made, can never be fully broken. The mountain remembers what happened there, and it waits with infinite patience for someone to forget why the seals were put in place. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another terrifying chapter from America's hidden history that they don't teach in history books. Another settlement that vanished from maps. Another community that discovered that the earth holds secrets that were never meant for human eyes.